couple of years, and both Stan and I had a minimal exposure to astrology before, one or two interesting suggestive encounters, and then a Jungian professor at Harvard had once, he had asked me my birth data, and once in a conversation he started telling me about he was a Swiss, he had been trained by Jung himself, and he started saying a few things about my birth chart, and I thought he'd taken leave of his senses, and this very intelligent man who up until this point I thought was someone I could really learn so much from, and now he's talking about astrology, which is the gold standard of superstition in our culture. I couldn't understand it, and so I kind of I steered the conversation back to our usual higher levels of cultural discussion. And what then happened, though, is in coming to Esalen, which was, I think in some sense, Esalen had a willingness to engage a multiplicity of perspectives from the past, from the ancient, from antiquity, from other cultures, esoteric, mystical, different practices, and there was a kind of metaphysical flexibility here, and also I can only call it like an enchanted worldview. I mean, it's not like there was a single worldview. This is a radically pluralistic place, still it is, but perhaps especially then, no one was allowed to capture the flag here, as Dick Price and Mike Murphy used to put it. And
Jeff Kripal also talks about Esalen and the religion of no religion.
Yeah. So it was open to these experiences. It was open to these perspectives, and astrology. Actually, Dane Ridjar came and taught here in the 60s. And of course, Stan and I were familiar with Jung, who had written about astrology and astrological research quite a bit, particularly in his essay on synchronicity, where he did this research project. So we are aware that Jung took it seriously, but it was the last of the either new paradigm or esoteric perspectives that we took seriously. We just could not see how something like this could work. And of course, to a certain extent, our image of astrology is being affected by, the caricature of it in the newspaper horoscope columns, the sun sign columns, the kind of naive concrete predictions and so forth.
Also, how this concept of linear causality kind of dominates the scientific thinking and thinking in general. Everything that happens as a cause, and also that has an effect. So when we talk about astrology, it sort of suggests that we are indicating that there is some kind of a direct influence of the stars on what's happening to us psychologically and what's happening in the world, which of course is completely bizarre, but it's not the way you think in astrology.
So the turning point happened when one day an astrologer came through one of the month-longs, late 75 or early 76, and he had a kind of simple but very committed grasp of astrology, and the idea in particular that of transits and how the planets as they move will move as they continue moving, they keep forming geometrical alignments with the planets at one's birth, or your horoscope, your natal chart. And that relationship between the planets in the sky now and the planets at your birth are what are called transits, or personal transits. And he showed us how to calculate birth charts and how to calculate. This is Arnie Tredovic, now deceased, he was an artist, but he taught us how to do the calculations, recommended a couple of textbooks that, particularly the German Evertine, very fine little book on transits, and another book by Coyne and Acker on predictive astrology. This is before Robert Hand's Planets in Transit had come out. And of course, this is back when you didn't have personal computers, you couldn't get those instantaneously produced and calculated charts. You had to do it by hand. There were a lot of calculations that went into each chart in each transit. So he convinced us that there was a possibility, from his experience, watching how people's lives were, the qualities of their experience were coherent with their transits as you would calculate them. We thought, well, what do we have to lose? We'll look at this. And both of us had good records and memories of our own personal LSD sessions for years into the past. And we did the calculations, looked at what the astrological tradition considered to be the meanings of, a Saturn transit or a transit from Pluto or from Neptune, Uranus, and so forth. And it was a great astonishment when we found such a consistent correlation that had a kind of nuanced precision to it. They were not concretely predicting the experience like for example, you could have an experience of, let's say the identification with a volcano, and this they would not say you're going to have an experience of identification with a volcano, but the descriptions would talk about experiences of great elemental intensity, catastrophic power. You would have to read into the descriptions to get a sense for where they were getting their concrete imagery from. And as I studied these descriptions carefully, I noticed that basically what they were describing were archetypal qualities. That if it was Mars, it had to do with the experience of aggression, of energetic force, of a kind of competitive urge, of a kind of physical energy, very active and even intrusive kind of forcefulness. And if it was Venus, it seemed to have to do with experiences involving the more erotic or romantic, aesthetic experiences of beauty, of sensuous experience, and so forth. And I started recognizing that what they were describing, what the textbooks were describing, were essentially Jungian archetypes but that were somehow connected to the planets. And I talked to Stan about how could this be? How could these correlations with our LSD experiences be so evocative, so compelling? And because I was still trying to figure it out in terms of a linear causal framework, and he said, from his perspective, it's not that the planets are in the moment sort of gravitation, like gravity waves or electromagnetic radiation. It's not like that. He said it's as if it's built into the universe itself. I remember you using that phrase. I think the way we put it now is that there's a kind of underlying coherence between the macrocosm and the microcosm, what in the ancients would say as above, so below. That that the universe is so integrated, inner and outer, human and cosmic, at all these different levels, that, as Plotinus puts it, everything is interconnected. All things breathe together. I love that phrase, all things breathe together. It gives a kind of organismic image of the coherence and how the planetary movements could be connected to the archetypal dynamics of the human being. So the first thing that I noticed was that there were certain transits that tended to occur under at the time of very difficult sessions, and then other transits that tended to occur at the time of major breakthroughs. It's a kind of simplistic distinction. Then, as time passed, I started seeing that it was much more complicated, because often you'll have difficult sessions that will open up into very triumphantly liberating sessions and very transformative. And you also get kind of shadow and light versions of the same archetypal domain. And gradually, I started noticing that the planetary transits involving the four outermost planets that we were tracking and that we have the best records of, not just we, but the astrological tradition, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Pluto's was considered a planet that at that point, still now it's considered a dwarf planet. It doesn't seem to have made any difference in its archetypal meaning and consequence in human affairs. What I noticed is that Stan's very precise description, his phenomenology of the four perinatal matrices, where the first matrix is that unitive, mystical, undifferentiated condition of the fetus in the womb, the sense of melted boundaries, the access to mystical unity with the divine, but also potential experiences of just metaphysical disorientation, disorienting lack of boundaries, easily prone towards projection, merging experiences, oceanic, aquatic, cosmic unity, all these things that he had linked to the first perinatal matrix, that is, prior to birth, when the fetus is still in the womb, but the birth contractions have not begun. All of those qualities of experience were relevant to what astrologers described as the Neptune archetype. And everything in the second matrix involving experiences of contraction, limit, encounter with mortality, guilt, oppression, depression, no exit, sense of being imprisoned within a material universe that was kind of relentlessly punitive, ending in death. All those were perfectly reflective of what astrologers would describe as the negative Saturn complex, and or what Jungians would call a negative Saturn, or the Chronos, or the negative Senex. And what Stan described as the third perinatal matrix, all the experiences that involve tremendous propulsive, volcanic, titanic energies that struggle for birth and struggle against death, life and death emergency, volcanic experiences, a fire catharsis, what Stan calls pyrocatharsis. Often there can be demonic imagery, experiences of scatological qualities, purgatorial, purging and cleansing, all often highly sexualized experiences, but also often connected with perversions and suffering, anxiety. All of these that stand, that's a lot of experiences there, a lot of categories of experiences in that one-third matrix, which stand connected to people in the birth process as they're struggling to be born, the birth, the cervix is open, and so the suffering is as intense as in the second matrix, but it's going somewhere. There's a sense of light at the end of the tunnel. There's a propulsion. While the second matrix is suffering with no meaning. It's meaningless. It's just relentlessly punitive, like a kind of Kafka-esque trial that you didn't even know what you did. All you know that you're being punished for it. And so this third matrix has this other quality, and all those categories are connected to what astrologers would describe as the Pluto archetype. Pluto, Hades, Dionysus, archetypal underworld, and Kali, Shiva, transformational power. And then finally the fourth matrix, that liberation of birth, the sudden awakening to new horizons, the unexpected, sudden sort of illumination of an emancipating insight and release of from a dangerous and seemingly irresolvable prison suddenly opening up, the birth itself. All of these are associated with what astrologers notice happen under Uranus transits, many, especially positive Uranus transits, where there's a sudden, unexpected release and opening, liberation, radical cosmic insight coming in, etc. Now, so here's one set of phenomena and categories that Stan has arrived at through depth psychology and LSD deep inner exploration. And then here's this other set of categories and phenomenologies that have been discerned through the astrological tradition, completely separate from the psychological tradition. And the parallels were so precise. I mean, those of you who are astrologers and those of you who have done this kind of, know the perinatal matrices and know Stan's work, know basically everything that is in those four perinatal matrices perfectly matches everything that is in those four planetary archetypal complexes. But it wasn't just the match. It's that when people had those transits involving those planets, that's when they had that kind of experience. And that was what was so astonishing. And it's like we had stumbled on, in this most unlikely of sources, this method for being able to discern the archetypal character and the timing of the quality of experience that people would have in non-ordinary states of consciousness. So we basically, first we were doing the research with our own sessions, and then those around us, the whole Esalen community, of course. At that point, I had been a night guard, looking at the, over here there's a point here below by the big house where there's now a fence there, but you used to be able to walk out on a promontory that was there's a narrow ledge out there, and after everybody was safely asleep at 3 in the morning, I'd go out and sit on that and just look at the stars and planets and the moon go over the ocean night after night, and I was just kind of taking in, this is before I knew any astrology, I was just taking in their numinosity. And then this happened that I just described, and because by that point my little son Christopher Flash was born, for whom we actually started the gazebo here along with Jenny Price. This is 35 years ago. I became a day guard so that I could get some sleep. And my son would wake up at 6, 7 in the morning, and so I'd be working at the gate shack and doing people's chart and transits. They would just be kind of lined up there one after another, and so I had this great I mean, really, this was the ideal laboratory for, because people come to the Esalen property and step onto it and start having transformative experiences, like as if they've dropped acid. It's a morphic field here that just seems to catalyze powerful transfer. I mean, they're coming here for that purpose very often, but also they are. There's a field. You tap into a memory in Sheldrake's sense, a kind of morphic field that helps, I think, constellate powerful transformative experiences. So we're just in this ideal place to be checking people's transits. Here's your experiences. Let's look at what's going on in terms of your transits. And the correlations were so impressive. I then started looking at, well, what did Galileo have when he turned the telescope to the heavens and had his opening of a whole new cosmos? Or what did Betty Friedan have when she wrote The Feminine Mystique and catalyzed the women's movement in the 60s, and Newton writing the Principia, and Einstein, things like that. And what I found was that the archetypal energies, they could express themselves as an LSD breakthrough in one case, or as a scientific breakthrough, or a literary achievement in another case, a creative opening. Or one person could have a very powerful experience of imprisonment in let's say an LSD session or a Gestalt session where they experience being in another lifetime and imprisoned by in a tyrannical government, and then that same transit for another person could be when they were literally in prison, like Oscar Wilde being sentenced to prison for his when he was imprisoned and sent to hard labor for having homosexual encounters and that whole drama there at the turn of the century. One person could have a spiritual breakthrough, and another person could have a breakthrough that had a much more secular quality. But it was the same archetype coming through. So this moved us towards a new conception of what were the forces at work in shaping the kinds of experiences that each individual was going through. And there's one further stage, and I'd like to pass this back to Stan to comment on, and that is, I then started looking at the large outer planet transits that were most relevant to understanding, well, a whole epoch will have a certain quality. And everybody who lived through the 60s knows that it had a quality that it was very distinct from what it was in the 1950s. Something was in the air or in the water, or there was a very distinctive zeitgeist that people tapped into. And it wasn't just being spread by word of mouth or by some single cause. It's as if people in different countries and different areas of life, in the arts, in the sciences, in social movements, in political movements, civil rights, feminism, rock music, sexual behavior patterns, technology, whatever it was, seemed to get a kind of injection of Shakti coming into it with like this of a very emancipatory but also disruptive and unpredictable quality. And when I looked and saw that from 1960 to 72 there was a Uranus-Pluto conjunction, the only one of the 20th century, and that the meanings of Uranus and Pluto so perfectly reflected the qualities of experience. I mean, basically, the Plutonic Dionysian quality of the 60s on the one hand, and the Uranian, which really a kind of Promethean impulse towards, that is the Prometheus archetype seems to be connected to Uranus, this impulse towards freedom and sudden breakthrough and the trickster archetype. You put those two together, and if a person gets it as an individual transit, they go through their own personal 60s. But this was a collective event that the whole world was going through. So we started seeing how the human psyche itself, it goes through, as a collective, goes through different evolutionary stages in which a particular archetypal gestalt will kind of possess it for a while, like the Saturn-Pluto opposition of the George W. Bush Cheney years, and 9/11 and so forth, in the same transits that were going on as at the beginning of World War I, the Saturn conjunct Pluto, or the beginning of World War II, when Stan was talking about it there in 1939-40, the Saturn square Pluto. These are different alignments, what are called hard aspect alignments of the same two planets. Saturn representing this much more potentially problematic, divisive energy. So we started watching how during the 1960s people were having these experiences that were highly kind of volcanically perinatal, and that as it moved into the 70s and the 80s, other planetary alignments were happening, and we noticed that whether it was in LSD experiences or holotropic breath work, but even the choice of what drugs tended to be used, like the tendency to be using more MDMA and ecstasy became much more dominant in the later 80s into the 90s, and people were, and ketamine, and people were having many more experiences of a tendency towards kind of euphoric merging experiences compared with that more volcanically mind-blowing LSD experience of the earlier period. So, Stan, you want to talk a little bit about the shift that took place in your understanding of, for example, the DSM and the ways in which diagnoses take place?
So there are all kinds of problems with psychiatry that are related to the fact that historically psychiatry developed as kind of sub-discipline of medicine. You know, in the 19th century there were tremendous successes in development in microbiology and biochemistry and so on, and this was eventually taken into psychiatric hospitals, a tendency to find some biological causes for mental disorders. And initially there were big successes. For example, it was discovered that it's called general paralysis, which is a state where people have grandiose delusions and problems with memory and intellect, was actually a tertiary state of syphilis. So the protozoan was identified, and then treatment came, and so on. In other cases, there were degenerative or circulatory problems or tumors, and so it created this kind of excitement about the possibilities of biological explanation in psychiatry. And then with the development of sort of pharmacological interventions that were able to symptomatically influence even those conditions that could not be biologically explained. So if you are agitated, you get tranquilizers. If you are depressed, you get antidepressant. If you cannot sleep, you get hypnotics and so on. And then there's whole connection with between psychiatry and pharmacological industry, the enormous money that was poured into it, somehow sealed this connection between medicine and psychiatry. Although eventually, it turned out that the absolute majority of psychiatric conditions cannot be really explained biologically, that they are psychogenic, as we call it. Certainly, the neuroses, many of the psychosomatic problems, but even a significant number of psychoses. There are psychoses which are organic, like senile dementia, others. But there are others which we call functional or endogenous, where really nothing was found, which is the majority of these states. The term endogenous does not mean anything. It's for anybody who knows something about medicine, this is a declaration of ignorance. Endogenous psychosis. Endogenous means generated from within. So we don't like to admit that we don't understand something. So we always find some kind of name for it that sounds very scholarly. So if you have epileptic seizures and it's after a trauma, it's called post-traumatic epilepsy. If you develop seizures and nothing is found, we don't say we don't have a clue. The person has seizures and say, well, this is idiopathic epilepsy, or this is essential epilepsy. So endogenous psychosis is that kind of situation. And this is why we could bring the concept of spiritual emergency for a significant number of those states, because there is really no biological explanation for them. Now, an important implication of this connection with medicine, between psychiatry and medicine, is the preoccupation with diagnosis. To put people into a certain diagnostic category, into a certain specific pigeonhole. And this is expressed in what's called DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Now, we have great problems with DSM. We have now DSM-5. There are tremendous fights around that. So the classification has been changing. The previous one was DSM-4, and then it became DSM-4 revised, and it's now DSM-5. And clinicians keep complaining that they cannot really match what they see in their clients with the categories in that book. There are also differences in the classification in different countries. For example, the French always had their own classification, which had very little to do with the ones which was used in the United States and so on.
Can you recall any particular French diseases?
Not specifically, it's a long time since I sort of looked at that.
It would just be an interesting sociological question to look at.
Not at the moment. I just know that it was completely different. The categories were very different. So the question is, where is the problem? It's also another thing that you see is that the diagnostic categories are changing. For example, when I was a beginning psychiatrist, if somebody would have a client with multiple personality, they would write a book about it, or maybe even make a movie about it. It was so rare. Whereas, I think, what was it, maybe 10 years ago, it was predominant. My brother was in the Ontario psychiatric hospital, and they had, I think, about 50 cases of multiple personalities there. And it was hard to find a psychiatrist who would not see at least one or two people with multiple personality.
I was going to say, the French have the DSK manual. When did they get that?
DSK?
You get that? The guy that was Dominic Strauss-Kahn.
DSK.
They call him DSK. He's a French guy.
Okay. So now this astrological approach throws a completely new light. The experiences that people have reflect, basically two different things. One is what we refer to as zeitgeist, which means something related to the collective transit. There is some kind of a general sort of archetypal situation, and then they have individual transits, which means these collective transits are somehow specifically related to their charts, where the planets are now related in a specific way to where they were at the time when they were born. And there is a systematic correlation between these individual transits and the experiences that people have. So on the one hand, you would have certain general predominance of certain kind of problems at a certain time, but there would also be very specific individual connections to the transits. So what you see when you look at it this way is that psychiatry really does not have a field of study, with the exception of those states which are explicitly organic, which are biological. Alzheimer's. You can find something in the brain, in the brain anatomy, in the physiology, biochemistry, and so on. But these, so-called functional disturbances, whether they are on the neurotic level or the psychotic level, they don't have any specific findings that would back that. What you see is that people have certain experiences and certain forms of behavior that the current model cannot explain. So instead of having this sort of fixed diagnosis, what we would have to have is certain instruments that would make it possible to analyze every individual situation at any particular time. Which means if you have a person who has some emotional, psychosomatic problems, you look at what the collective transits are and how they are related to the person's chart, and you would find a specific correlation there, and that would then change as time goes on and the transits are changing. So we would get to another area where there would be significant increase in certain kinds of phenomena, and others would emerge and so on. Now, if you look at the situation, you would also have to take into consideration the chart and the transits of the psychiatrists, because it seems that there is a connection there. It has been described in traditional literature. There's some kind of an affinity. Certain psychiatrists are attracting certain types of patients, or are able to see certain phenomena in the patients that other people would not see. They would have a kind of selective sensitivity. So I believe that this would solve many of the problems related to diagnosis if we would use this sort of archetypal astrology, a combination of archetypal psychology and astrology. And we certainly have to move away from that preoccupation with diagnosis, because the diagnosis does not mean in psychiatry what it means in medicine. In medicine, if you make a diagnosis, you are dealing with what's called a nosological unit. Nosos means disease, nosological unit, which means it implies certain kind of etiology. You have some sense of what causes this disorder. It has some implication for what's called pathogenesis, how the symptoms develop. It has to give you some idea of prognosis, and also some indication for the type of therapy that you would use. For example, it's important to identify the type of infection that you have, because different infections would respond to different forms of antibiotic or other kind of form of treatment, like sulfur drugs and so on. It's important to identify the type of anemia that you have, because one would respond to vitamin B12 and another one would require iron and so on. So the diagnosis in medicine really is important. And if you make a diagnosis, make a wrong diagnosis, somebody who's a better doctor can correct you and can prove, that you made a mistake. Whereas in psychiatry, if you give the patient to 10 different psychiatrists, they will not agree on the diagnosis. And the diagnosis also will have very little implication to what's going to be done with the patient. So there would be, psychiatrists would do psychotherapy with psychosis. And, when I was in Baltimore, there was a place called Ellicott City, where there was a psychiatric hospital owned by two brothers, and just about everybody, including neurotics, would come there with electroshocks, because it was cheap for the hospital. It was the patients had to pay significantly for it. It was very, very kind of seemingly impressive kind of approach. So basically, the diagnosis that you make does not commit you to any specific treatment. In pharmacology, you basically choose some pharmacotherapy, and if there are too many side effects, or if it doesn't work, you just sort of move to another medication. So we really need a different kind of approach to these psychogenic kind of disorders, and I really believe that this combination of archetypal psychology and astrology would be a really important change. Now, this would be particularly important in the case of what we call spiritual emergencies. And I hope that we would agree that we haven't seen a single case of spiritual emergency where there would not be art aspect. The three outer planets, would you say?
Yeah, it's very very consistent correlation.
So if somebody has, what we call spiritual emergency, which means very significant symptomatology, and would go to a traditional psychiatrist, the idea is this is psychosis. This person will be psychotic for the rest of their life. Even if you don't have any more episodes, with just one episode, you would be seen as psychotic in remission. Just the fact that you were able to generate that kind of experience would give you this kind of a label, diagnostic label. Now, if you get a diagnosis, the idea also is that there's nothing you can sort of predict about it. I mean, it can just come back at any time. There's no, there is no known dynamics behind it. Whereas if you have the astrological archetypal approach, you would be able to say when there might be other times where there is a good possibility that similar or same kind of symptoms would occur again. Would be periods when there would be less likely that the person would experience some psychological disturbances. It would also, if you have spiritual emergency, it would give you a sense that you have some roadmap, because you see the timing of it. The transit would begin and culminate and then subside. And it would also give you some sense of the content. It would give you the archetypal prediction of the content of that experience that you would expect at that time.
When it becomes especially useful is when you look at the whole life, and then you'll take different, you can see different parts of the chart, what we call different aspects, like a conjunction or opposition of two planets, that will be connected to particular, not only psychological symptoms, but also to what Stan has described as coexistence. That is, like a number of events and experiences that have taken place in the course of a life, all of which have the same quality. Like, for example, the experience of abandonment. It could be the abandonment that happened in adult life as a spouse, but then there could be a feeling of have a deeper root in the abandonment of the family by one of the parents. But then, as a person does a lot of deep, let's say, holotropic breath work or LSD therapy, they could tap into a place where they realize that their primal experience of abandonment took place at birth, where one lost the womb, the all-encompassing, nurturing source of their existence. When we tap into that level, the perinatal, you can see a kind of ground or root form of all subsequent experiences of, let's say, abandonment, or it could be constriction in another case, or it could be positive coexistence of feeling loved, unconditionally loved, or creatively fulfilled, and so forth. And what we find is that each time that particular part of the birth chart is being transited by major planetary transits, which usually involves the outer planets, because those are the ones that last a long time and correlate with the most potent experiential qualities. Well, you find that each time that transit takes place, there will be correlating events and experiences that kind of build up the coex in the course of a life. And then there can be this, when you're doing your inner work under those transits, we find that you can kind of find other ways of experiencing the same energy and actually even releasing it. So if you see a transit coming, rather than acting it out in the same blind way of, like, let's say, yet another relationship that implodes, or drawing towards one another absolutely claustrophobic career move, where you experience your boss as being ruthlessly exploitative or oppressive, where we are able to see how the same energy, if it is experienced within through inner exploration and tapping into the earlier psychological and biographical roots of it, you can release those energies, and they're getting constellated, the same as if you were acting it out and having a new trauma. But now you're kind of turning around the picture, and it becomes a very useful. And I remember a woman here who lived at Esalen, who actually she had been through shock treatment herself, and Dick Price had kind of taken her under his wing in certain ways, and she had a very difficult Grand Cross, Moon, Saturn, Uranus, and Pluto, and every time that would get activated, she, in earlier years, would have real crises. I mean, sometimes it was involved, familial crises that had a great emotional impact, and then it became her breakdowns. And once we got that picture and saw how it worked, when those transits started coming again, she would prepare for it with she'd do Gestalt work. She'd kind of be breathing through it, as it were, and find ways of releasing the energy that would be more life-enhancing rather than unconsciously destructive. So the whole idea is to And when we see a person who draws towards them the same, let's say, abusive spouse 3 times in a row, they get married, and each time it's an abusive relationship. I mean, the first time you can say it's that was an unfortunate choice. The second and third time, it begins to look like a pattern that's being acted out unconsciously, and what the archetypal astrological perspective allows us is a kind of window into what energies are active at what time, what archetypal principles are in interaction at a particular time and in what ways, and then how can we use that energy in a more life-enhancing way. Maybe I'll just, as we're getting towards dinner time, I just want to point out just one use of this perspective, and then when we come back, we have a good substantial evening at 7:30. When we come back, we can start with Stan's chart. But what we found was that when we look at the charts of people of like Sigmund Freud's chart or Jung's chart, you see that their birth charts are highly correlated with the kind of psychology that they saw as being the universal psychology of the human being. In other words, what they saw as being Freud's understanding of the psyche was a generalization of the way his psychic field was constellated in a certain way, or as Stan would put it, it's a kind of he became a kind of his theory is a kind of reflects the fact that he's a spokesperson for the transits of the aspects of his natal chart. And we each do that. We see the world through a certain filter that, on the one hand, allows us to see things that other people can't see in a good way. It opens things up. We're highly sensitive to particular dimensions of existence that might not have otherwise been visible to others. And at the same time, it can create an illusion, a maya, a very persuasive picture that this is real and it's objectively true for everybody. And so we begin to get a sense for how studying the birth chart gives us a way of framing why this person has this kind of perspective and how they draw towards them a certain category of patient and what they emphasize with those patients. And we also get a sense for the patient population that they're seeing at a given period, because they're seeing patients under a set of world transits that have their own character. And then finally, this is also true of Stan's chart. What's quite remarkable is how much his particular understanding of the perinatal matrices that kind of, as it were, used him as a vessel to come to consciousness and be communicated to the collective. How much that is reflected in his birth chart. And the one other time in the first half century of his life that the planets moved into the same aspects, or the same what's called hard aspect alignments, or quadrature alignments of the planets Saturn, Uranus, and Pluto. He was born with them in what's called the T-square. And between 1965 and 67, Saturn, Uranus, and Pluto again came into hard aspect with this tremendous kind of propulsive Plutonic energy meeting the Saturnian limits and structurings that are associated with the Saturn archetype, with Uranus in there as well, representing this liberating breakthrough kind of energy. And as we'll see when we'll put it up here on the screen to give it more vivid graphic form, his own chart and transits are very much a reflection of, or rather, his theories and the kind of experiences that he was able to mediate in others is very much a reflection of the archetypal dynamics of his own birth chart. And what we found is that as the decades passed, the perinatal experience was not as widespread in the 80s, for example, in the 90s, and other kinds of experiences became more dominant in the holotropic breathwork. People would still get perinatal experiences, but it wasn't the exclusive avenue into the transpersonal. And as it happens, we're now back into a very powerful Saturn, Uranus, and Pluto. This is the third one since Stan was born. There was then when he was born, and there was the mid-1960s, and now we're into another one where the Promethean energies are being powerfully activated. The world's in revolutionary turmoil, and there's a tremendous polarization of opposing forces. So it's kind of timely that we're having these discussions. So anyway, I think we should probably please
just a couple of sentences here. So I was talking about the development, from the model psychosis, then trying to apply Freud to the LSD work, then a period when there was tremendous emphasis on the perinatal, sort of discovering the importance of birth for psychology, and then the movement really towards the archetypal. So where we are now, presently, the primary thinking is archetypal. So the idea would be, if you do a breathwork session or if you do a psychedelic session, it seems that you tune into the archetypal field or fields of your transiting planets. And then within that context, you can get a corresponding sample of biographical experiences or one of the matrices that reflects somehow that archetypal energy, or some kind of a transpersonal expression of that, which could be a past life experience or quite specifically experiencing archetypes. You can experience archetypal figures, archetypal motifs. But the primary thinking now is in terms of the archetypes. It's the archetypal energy that really determines what you experience, and within that you get the selection of the different realms or the different levels of the unconscious.
It gives a more flexible conceptual frame of reference for illuminating the qualities of non-ordinary states of consciousness and psychological states and spiritual crises and so forth. But it also reconnects the human psyche to the cosmos in a way that the Cartesian mind could not grasp. And really, modernity is to a great extent a kind of unpacking of the Cartesian split between subject and object, and between a realm of meaning and purpose, which was seen as being totally subjectively contained inside the human psyche, versus the world of matter and energy, which is seen as being unconscious, impersonal, purposeless, randomly evolving. And this suggests, the evidence suggests a kind of healing in itself, whereby the human psyche discovers that it is embedded in as it were, an anima mundi, a cosmic psyche, a soul of the world, that the world is ensouled. It's not this mechanistic, disenchanted void of meaning within which we are all meaning-seeking specks of dust. Rather, we are each expressions of an ensouled cosmos, and archetypal astrology permits a kind of window into our particular relationship to an expression of this cosmically expansive archetypal psyche. There's a beautiful sentence which I think I have with me from the Polish writer Bruno Schulz that describes this exact transition that I think we've been talking to you about today that we went through. This is an early 20th century Polish writer, some kind of like the Polish, something like Kafka in Poland, Bruno Schulz. And he said this: "So it comes to pass that when we pursue an inquiry beyond a certain depth, we step out of the field of psychological categories and enter the sphere of the ultimate mysteries of life. The floorboards of the soul to which we try to penetrate fan open and reveal the starry firmament." It's a very vivid image. The floorboards of the soul to which we try to penetrate, as in like depth psychology, fan open and reveal the starry firmament. That sense that you go deep enough into the interior, and suddenly you find yourself like in the Mobius strip, opened up into not only into the cosmos, but into a revisioned cosmos.
It really reflects what you find in many of the esoteric systems, that each individual is like a microcosm containing, in a sense, the whole universe. You know, as above, so below, as without, so within. So it seems like absurd if you think in terms of Western science, in terms of what you can measure and what you can weigh. You know, that you would be somehow identical with the whole universe. But in terms of the information or the ability to experience the universe, in a sense, we are commensurate. We are identical with the universe. And the way we can explore the universe is either going out and using the senses and then analysis and synthesis of what you see, or going inside when then this flip happens, the kind of multi-dimensional movies strip, where as you go deep enough, suddenly you start experiencing the world at large. It's also coded there, or becomes accessible through the inner exploration.
And astrology seems to provide this way of, in a sense, like the meeting point of spirit and matter becomes much more radical. That the cosmos has this intimate and, as it were, caring a relationship to the nuances of the unfolding of each of our lives. It suggests that the earth itself is a center or a focus, a moving center of cosmic significance, and also that each individual is a focus of cosmic meaning as well. So it kind of brings the Copernican revolution back home, as it were, where we move back into a meaningful cosmos, but it's a radically expanded one, and it's not fixed. It's changing as we speak. Well, so we come back a little earlier than last night. We'll be here at 7:30.
We're leaving a bit later, so we have to realistically. Do we have time?
Okay, why don't we make it 7:45 that we start here tonight? So 7:45, and we'll do the. We're going to have the documentary tonight, and we'll get Stan's for the church.
Okay, can I see Rebecca?
Of at CIS on the subject, and often we do it here, other places. But in that situation, we have much more preparation for looking at a birth chart and grasping the if everybody knows what these different things are, it's like that's a symbol for Venus. Most people know that. There's the sun. There's the moon. And when planets are in a geometrical alignment, such as this quadruple conjunction, all opposite this conjunction of two planets, and they're in what's called a T-square, 90 degrees each to Uranus here. That's a very potent and demanding configuration. I'll unpack it a little bit in a minute. And whenever you have a planet on either rising or setting, the ascendant or descendant, or the midheaven and the nadir or the IC, the base of the chart, that's a very powerful position for a planet to be in as well. Basically, this is a portrait of the heavens at the moment of birth, and so the person's here on the earth, and in this case, Stan is born just before 7 p.m. in the summer, Central European time in Prague, and so the sun is approaching the western horizon. It is not, in a way, it's like right the way it is right now out in the sky now. The sun's out here just above the western horizon over the Pacific. That's the way it was when he was born in Prague. And then all these planets would have been invisible to somebody standing outside at that moment, because obviously the sun is out, so you can't see anything else. Later that night, after the sun had set, the moon and Saturn would be visible moving across the sky as the whole Earth is rotating in this direction, so the sky will move or appear to move in this direction. So I'll just give a few of I'll just unpack this very quickly, conscious of the extent to which I'm condensing information here and not doing an adequate job of preparing for all the interpretive work. Let me just say one thing in general about looking at a birth chart. Following up that point I was making earlier about how the birth chart does not give you concrete information about, let's say, the moral quality of the person, or two people can have the same aspect, like a Sun-Uranus conjunction, and one person can be a great scientific revolutionary, another person can be a great cultural Promethean hero, like Bob Dylan, and another person can be a juvenile delinquent rebel, or you can be both of those at the same time, like Shelley or something like that, where you can be having both the shadow and the noble side of the same archetypal complex. But you can't tell, looking at the chart, whether this person is going to have a 100-watt version or a 1,000-watt version or a 1-watt version of the same archetypal energy, or whether it will be noble or ignoble, profound or trivial. These are things that there's other factors that shape that, like karma, perhaps, grace, culture, historical circumstances, and so forth. Now, in general, astrology seems to give us the great chordal structures, in the sense of music, like chords, the great chordal structures of our lives, but they do not, the planetary positions don't tell us what melodies we're going to sing to those chordal structures. They don't, like what melodies we sing, what dances we dance to, what even genre whether it's classical or jazz or hip hop. Those things are shaped by other factors: choice, culture, level of consciousness, and so forth. So in Stan's chart, the first thing that I would look at is the fact that he's got this quadruple conjunction with the sun, which you look at where the sun and moon are and what are the big aspects with the sun and moon. And particularly if there's conjunctions going on, that's going to be, those planetary energies are going to be kind of coming through the central principle of selfhood that is symbolized by the sun. And with Stan, first of all, there's the Sun-Mercury conjunction. Mercury is the messenger of the gods. Represents the principle of logos, of mind, of communication, of thinking, of reading, of teaching, of writing, of taking in information and processing it and imparting it, and a whole kind of identification with the Mercury function of logos. And in his case, it's greatly intensified and empowered by the triple conjunction with Pluto. You see that with the voracious appetite for reading, and that was very early in your life. You were describing last night. You see, like, people who have Pluto with Mercury, often, like Darwin, for example, or Freud, there's a tendency towards wanting to penetrate below the surface of the phenomenon in order to understand the deeper dynamics of what's at work. Pluto wants to penetrate, it wants to get deep. But there's also with the sun there, it's like the powerful personality, the often engaged with the elemental forces of the underworld, of the psyche, of nature, interest in nature and animals, identification with animal. You see, like, Stan's got all these experiences of becoming whales and trees and different forms of life. But I think the descent into the underworld is, you and Nietzsche both have that Sun-Pluto aspect. But then when you have Jupiter in there too, you see Jupiter-Pluto where there can be a tendency towards great descent being the Plutonic, underworld descent, and then where the power is and where the transformative, regenerative energy is. And then with Jupiter, Jupiter is the principle of expansion and elevation and success, and more problematically, like inflation, excess. But the Jupiter-Pluto combination, you see at its best. This is the chart of it's the aspect of the death rebirth process.
Oops.
Let's see.
He's got to move the mouse.
I'll bring this over here so I can tap it every once in a while. You see Jupiter-Pluto with the high priest archetype. The kind of shamanic power comes from the Pluto, and the Jupiter gives it crowns that. It gives it honor. It gives it elevation. Gives it a kind of successful expansion and often recognition in the culture. But at its best, you see it with people who have a kind of, as a result of the depth and power of transformative energy and change, transformation that they've gone through. It comes through with a certain moral authority or certain spiritual power. Of, like, powerful leaders often have it, like Lincoln, like all the presidents that are on Rushmore are all Jupiter-Pluto figures, like Lincoln and Washington and Roosevelt, and the most recent Roosevelt, FDR had a conjunction as well. A powerful leader, and I think that confidence that Stan has in the capacity, in the descent, that it will end up in a positive place, is that's particularly strong there with the Jupiter. But it's all opposed to Saturn. That Saturn opposite Pluto is very tight. You can see 20 to 20. Those of you who've read Cosmos and Psyche know I basically give, I unpack the Saturn-Pluto. I follow very closely in history every time Saturn and Pluto came into quadrature alignment, the conjunction, the square, and the opposition. And then I do the same thing with Uranus and Pluto, the conjunction like in the 60s, or the square that happened in the 30s and again is happening now, or the opposition. And the fact that Stan basically has the combination of the Uranus-Pluto, that kind of 60s driving energy of revolutionary transformation, and the Saturn opposite Pluto, which is often like confronting very challenging, constraining circumstances, or even the sense of facing the shadow side of existence and the dark, mortal urgencies of life and death. The gravitas, that weighty gravitas, you can, that solidity of character that you get when you hear Stan talking, that grounded weightiness that comes from having kind of hit rock bottom and landed and knowing where he is, but having faced such powerfully constraining circumstances interiorly as well as in his external life. That's the Saturn opposite Pluto. But it's all in this very dynamic and rather kind of unstable. Uranus is in this T-square with it. See, the whole world is getting this right now. This whole sense of constant, unpredictable, emancipatory energies that are disrupting the status quo and causing crises and accidents and demonstrations and eruptions of energy that is pushing towards change of all kinds. That's what's in the air. It's a very powerful and not easy configuration. It's been going on from 2008 to 2011. Stan was born under the version that happened from 1929 to 33, when again there was a global economic collapse. Again, there were powerful forces at work that were destabilizing societies, and it's a dicey kind of aspect. And yet, I think particularly when the shorter period there, when Jupiter was in the alignment, that was a period when, during that 10-month period, Stan was born, Gorbachev was born, both of the founders of Esalen, Dick Price and Mike Murphy, were born. Ron Bess was born. Father Bruno Barnhart, the head of the Hermitage up here, very powerful spirit here in Big Sur. That generation was carrying a tremendous force of personality and spiritual regenerative power, and I think they all presided over collapses of structures. Think of Ron Dass. I mean, his whole thing was, back from 1968, was describing the collapse of his own life structure and then the collapse of the whole Western egos project, and his redemption in Eastern mystical thought and experience. And think of Gorbachev presiding over the collapse of the Soviet Empire and basically mediating it, facilitating it, watching over it, and stand one paradigm crisis after another, one collapsing ego structure after another. You know, he would in the morning start one LSD session with a patient, and you know, LSD. I mean, you're looking at a long trajectory, 8 hours that you're watching over this person. But as soon as that person, he'd be working with a nurse. As soon as that person was starting to come down, he'd have a second one starting, and then he'd be with that person till the end of the day. And it was day after day of doing that. And he's told me about how it's like there was nothing more interesting to him than this, because people were experiencing things that shouldn't have been experienced according to the conventional paradigm, and they were all kind of like reporting back these kind of inner space adventures, and he was Houston Control, I guess. And the fact that it's right on the IC, that brings in a particularly potent expression of that Promethean energy. Now, this Mars-Neptune conjunction is an interesting combination because Mars is the warrior, but Neptune is that spiritual, imaginal, consciousness altering kind of archetype. It's totally the opposite of Mars in nature. I mean, if you're just in a Mars place, it's energetically willful. It's the warrior. Neptune's completely like the surrendering mystic. It's the going with the flow. It's the interest in the mystical, or the meditative transcendence, or it could be drugs and alcohol or something like that as well. Anything that permits some form of transcendence, whether it's a high level or a low level version of it. Well, there's many ways Mars and Neptune can come through, but one of the ways is for the warrior archetype to express itself in the domain of altered states of consciousness, of the spiritual dimension. You know, somebody who had this in a much more problematic version, because he had it in the T-square with Saturn, is Carlos Castaneda, who, again, he really had that warrior archetype that was being expressed within the realm of taking psychoactive substances in the shamanic context. But life for him, I mean, it was like